our delegation to the May Day to Cuba for May as part of the May Day labor delegation is Rob Bartlett, who is member of the Railroad Workers United, DSA, and Illinois Federation of Teachers Local 571.
No, I would basically want to have 4 topics. I want to talk about my impression of Cuba, having been there 15 years ago, and then just recently going. Then I want to talk a little bit about the problems of basically trying to build socialism in one country, because that's the context of Cuba's existence since the revolution. Then I want to talk about the achievements, the real ones, and the limitations that we have, and then also I want to talk about what the people think in Cuba and what they want. And of course, all of these things are impressionistic, my impression, things that people of other have said to me. So there are limitations. You can take it as you like. First of all, when you get in downtown Cuba, it's startling. It's like a ghost town. The streets are deserted, there's very little traffic, very few cars, electric vehicles, and so on. Tourists, non-existent practically from when I was there 15 years ago. Power outages, as was mentioned, absolutely true. They seem to be scheduled within Havana, but they would seem to be longer when we went out into the countryside. So that is a real problem. Although I would also say that many more homes have solar panels than I see in the US, and so many of them have battery backup. So that's a step of progress. People in general, it does seem poorer right now, and so the situation seems pretty dire. Economically, to go over, people don't know the history of this, but back in the early days of the revolution, the economy was pretty much centered around sugar, and that was the single cash crop. And of course, there was much support from the Soviet Union, and when the Soviet Union fell in the 1990, there was a special period, which was a period of crisis. Since then, there's been a development of a new industry, and that's the tourism. I would also like to say that the resources of any country are limited. The people that we talked to in Cuba or who talked to us said that Cuba had nickel, cobalt. I would say they have human resources because of the education there that are real. And they also have a beautiful location which can be developed for tourism. So what's happened since then is there's been a growing sector which is partly private, it's a private sector. It's investment from countries in Europe and so on that have built resorts like Varadero, big hotels in Havana that cater to tourists, and so that definitely has been an important part of their economy. And so there's been a real benefit. Anyone who works in the tourist or adjacent to the tourist industry probably has better access to income, and that's a real thing. Now there's a negative to this, because that creates a disparity between those who are, especially like on the beaches or where the hotels are in large cities, or people in the rural areas. There are some people who have access to this capital, this money, through tips and so on, dollars, which are real. And I'll just mention that the real thing that we can see is that we know there are supports from the state in terms of staples in stores to provide things like rice, beans, cooking oil, and so on. But on the other hand, there are dollar stores, not like here, but stores where you have to pay in dollars. So that right there basically means that there are people who have dollars and people who don't. And so that's a little bit of a growing gap, which I think is causing some dissatisfaction. The next point is about the achievements. I'm sure Stacy is really going to talk about education and medical way more than I am going to. But I'm going to mention a couple of things anyway. There's no doubt that education has been extended throughout Cuba. But I think that both education and medicine are suffering from the blockade tremendously. And there's no doubt about that. I don't know if Stacy's going to quote the figures, but the one that stuck in my mind was the natal mortality rate, having been once at 3.5 per thousand, which is lower than the US, and now it's up to about 9 per thousand. And that's certainly a direct reaction to that. One thing I think is that I had visited Nicaragua after the revolution in 81 and 83. And I remember in 81 a huge sense of optimism as they were expanding programs like literacy and so on. And then going back in 83, when the Contra War had started, and it had a huge impact on it. I don't think it's been something like that because this blockade has been going on for 70 years now, or something on that level, not quite 70. Lessening of poverty, definitely real, but still nonetheless, it's maybe not exactly what we'd like. We visited an interesting place, the biotechnology sector place, and I have a little bit of experience in that as a teacher, and I have to say that they have very competent people who know a lot, but because they're walled off from the international community, the ability to travel conferences and exchange ideas because of secondary boycotts that the US does, it limits what they're able to do. And so I think they're probably years behind in the technology. So they have to use technologies that maybe people in research labs in the US used maybe 20 years ago. It's become increasingly automated and it's very expensive material to get. So that I think is a problem, and of course the effect it has on medicine is to be able to make the medicines that they've developed, you actually have to be able to import in expensive materials, chemicals and biological reagents, which are not able to be produced in the country. That's dependent upon foreign trade, and that's a real, that's an obstacle. So now really the thing that I think is all of us probably have a lot of differing ideas about is what do people think? And really, we had a chance to talk to people in one formal setting. That was the Rosario Cardenas dance school, which I thought was fascinating. And one thing I would say there is that, first of all, people are not afraid to tell you what they think. If they think the government is bad, they will tell you that. There's no censorship there. But on the other hand, but they also tell you, I think, a lot of the things. Like, I think some of the people at the dance school ask very good questions of them, like, what do you want? And I know that the dancers that I talked to basically feel, well, they told me things like, I have to work 3 jobs to be able to do this. One of them being a dancer in a club. Same person told me, I will not do anything illegal. And I think you understand what that she's talking about. Mm-hmm. And so that is a problem. People want life to be better. And many of them express the desire to be able to travel. Some of them outright said, I'd like to live somewhere else. I'd like to live in Europe. One of the people that we talked to, or talked to us in the beginning, said that of the immigration from Cuba, 65% of it came from Havana, and most of the people were well educated. So you can imagine that this is an effect of basically people who have benefited from the education system, but see that what they really want from life is maybe very difficult to do. And so I think they're being forced to make personal decisions about what to do. Continue to work and many jobs and scrape by, or make a very difficult choice and leave. Now, they're going back to the inequality. It's not just the people who have access to the tourist industry, it's also the immigrants who send remittances back. This is a huge support for the country. So I'm just going to make a couple of quick, I should mention the salaries. Mm-hmm. I feel very privileged having been able to go there and have a nice meal that maybe cost me 6,000 or 7,000 pesos. That's more than the average base salary in Cuba per month, which is maybe 3,000 or 4,000, which means $6 or $8 a month. And so this is startling for anyone who has access to stuff that we do. The thing I think that's really difficult is that they're in a bind. Unless we can actually get foreign countries to be able to break the blockade, despite the sanctions in the US, which I think is going to be a really hard thing to do, the pressure that we can put forward are important. But we have to be able to show international solidarity and say, we can't allow countries to be starved. We can't allow countries to be boycotted, to have all of these things, to be threatened with military action, to be engaged in war, which is the real thing. And if we can be able to build an effective movement that can unite people around the world who probably share these ideas, this situation is probably going to continue. So I was encouraged, and also I want to be realistic about what I saw.